The main theme of this course is the reorganization of production or of the market order, of democracy, and of culture and education, so that we can reinvent or resurrect the progressive project in the contemporary world. But in the next two classes, before we come directly to that main theme, we're going to address how, in general, the progressive task presents itself in two contemporary settings, the United States and the European Union. And the programmatic discussion in these two classes is necessarily schematic. I'm going to return to everything, to all the major themes later on in the main part of the course. But you shouldn't hesitate to interrupt me and to question these necessarily vague ideas of these two classes. Now, first, the United States. And I want to divide my discussion into two parts. The first part is the American historical experience, and the second part is the character of the American progressive project, if we could imagine it. But I want to begin with the realm of consciousness and with the message of what you could call the American prophets, people like Lincoln and Whitman and Emerson. And their flip side, as it were, also the melancholic prophets like Melville. What is the message? And now I'm going to simplify radically, as I must in every part of this American discussion. The message is that the individual is not simply in communion with God, transacting with the creative and redemptive God, but in some real sense the individual is God, the deification of the human being. And this idea has a basis in what you could call the third element of the American religiosity. The first element are the organized forms of Protestantism and Catholicism. The second element is the secular humanism, which is to a very large extent a secularization of the Christian faith. And the third part are what Harold Bloom called the American religion. The religions that the Americans themselves invented, like Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. And it's there in that third theme, in that third strand of the American spirituality, that the distinctive character of this American prophecy becomes most manifest. The individual is not simply transacting with God, connected to God. The individual is in some real sense part of the divinity. And our task in the world is to increase our quota in the divine attribute of transcendence. We don't live to become more godlike. We become more godlike in order to live, because the attributes of life are the attributes of transcendence. Surfeit over structure, spontaneity, surprise, and fecundity in the creation of the new. Now, this American prophecy, with its radical and unsettling character, had from the very beginning two blots. There were two stains on the prophetic message. So on this view, which I'm stating in this radically simplified form, it's not enough to enact the message of the prophets. The message of the prophets has to be corrected before it's enacted. And it's defective, according to this view, for two fundamental reasons. The first reason is that it is contaminated by a disturbed view of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. The disturbance lies in the idea that the individual must now ultimately be like a little Napoleon who crowns himself. He lifts himself up, he makes himself. This theology is related to a program of self-construction, of self-fashioning. And as he lifts himself up, he becomes capable of generosity. So solidarity comes after self-fashioning. It's not a part of self-fashioning. And therein lies the first defect of this spiritual vision. I approached it indirectly in an earlier class when I described the nature of freedom. And I argued that the first dimension of freedom lies in our relation to the others. Freedom is in part an ability to experience self-assertion, the sentiment of being, in the relation to the other, in such a way that the experience of connection is not just Sartre's "the others are hell," but it is through connection that I come to possess myself. And I said then that we have that experience when we have it most completely in love. And the problem is that love cannot flourish out of the sphere of intimacy. So among strangers, we need a counterpart to love. Christ said, love the stranger. But it seems that we can't love the stranger, which is why the moral philosophers give us as an alternative the cold shoulder of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. The counterpart to love in life among strangers would be cooperation. And the main institutional forms of cooperation in these societies are economic, the market. The market is a simplified form of cooperation that may be unnecessary when there is high trust and is impossible when there is no trust. It depends on the generalization of a modicum of trust, of low trust among strangers. And the other form of cooperation is democracy. Democracy is a form of cooperation. When it is imagined as having a permanent mechanism, a machinery, that then perpetuates its impulse. The second stain on the prophetic message on the message of the American prophets is institutional idolatry. Institutional idolatry is the view that there is one form of institutional life in the economy and in politics which is canonical, which is sacrosanct. And you could say that this view should be heretical to a Christian because all the institutional forms are dust in the eyes of God. But it was a characteristic of the American consciousness, and it's present in the message of the American prophets. So, in the criticism of American institutions, the two stains of the disturbed view of the relation between self-fashioning and solidarity and of institutional idolatry would have to be corrected. Now, where is institutional idolatry taken to a fever pitch, to the highest point in the American consciousness? In the cult of the Constitution. The slogan in the Civil War was, "The Union and the Constitution forever," in direct opposition to the teachings of one of the founders, Thomas Jefferson, who insisted that the Constitution should be trashed every 2 generations and a new one invented so that the dead not be governed, so that the living not be governed by the dead. The cult of the Constitution illustrates the cost of this institutional idolatry. In the United States, forever, the main way to change the Constitution has been to reinterpret it rather than to amend it directly, because the amendment process presents a very difficult hurdle. But the Americans seem not to be completely aware of the consequences of this tilt. The imperative of changing the Constitution by amending it has substantive consequences. It tilts constitutional revision toward the reinterpretation of rights and away from the institutional structure. So it's relatively easy to pretend that the Equal Protection Clause means one thing rather than another thing. That means something different from what it was thought to mean before. But it's difficult to imagine that when the Constitution says there are 3 co-equal branches of government, it really means that there are 5. So the whole nature of constitutional revision in the United States is tilted in a particular direction. Napoleon Bonaparte advised that a constitution should be brief and obscure, but it seems that the only people who followed his advice were the Americans. Now let me stop for a moment and ask whether someone would like to make a comment about this first set of observations. This is just the realm of consciousness. Now what I next want to say is to describe the early American project of development in the period between independence and the Civil War, in the antebellum period, when the United States was what we would now call a developing country. And what was the fundamental nature of this development project? It had two parts in it, one part of which is much more obvious than the other. The obvious part was the Hamiltonian project of nation building. The country was literally built and opened up through railroads and first roads and canals, its whole physical structure, and this vast frontier. And this Nasserite project, this project of forced mobilization and national development, was orchestrated by a clique of politicians, bureaucrats, adventurers, entrepreneurs, using as their financial instrument the First and the Second Bank of the United States. But the United States would not have become what it did become if this Hamiltonian project had not interacted with something entirely different and much more surprising. It interacted with the democratization of the economy in what were then the two most important sectors of production: agriculture and finance. In agriculture, the Americans rejected the English path of agrarian concentration, which at that time both the leftists and the conservatives believed to be inevitable. They distributed the land, the public lands on the frontier through the Homestead Acts, and they organized what in today's vocabulary we would describe as a decentralized strategic partnership between the government and the family farmer, and cooperative competition among the family farmers. They invented a form of the agricultural market that had never existed before. And in this way, they developed the most efficient form of agriculture by a family scale that had ever existed in the world up to that point. It was the most efficient form of agriculture, and paradoxically, it was of limited scale, of the scale of the family farmer. So agriculture confronts a unique set of difficulties, confronts a combination of price volatility and climate volatility, physical risk and economic risk, and they organized a system of dealing with these risks, without which no system of family-scale agriculture has ever survived for long in the world. Food stockpiles, price supports to secure family-scale agriculture against its distinctive profile of risk. They brought agronomic science to the door of the family farmer, establishing the land-grant colleges. Lifting up the technical capabilities of the family farmer. And the family farmers among themselves achieved economies of scale by cooperating, by sharing agricultural silos and instruments, and by working on each other's land. And this operation produced a sensational result and led to remarkable economic breakthrough in the United States. The second sector was finance. There was a struggle over the national bank, which was the main instrument of the nascent American plutocracy. And the struggle culminated in the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the dissolution of the Second National Bank of the United States. And for over 100 years, any bank was prohibited from operating in more than one state of the Union. The result is that the Americans developed the most decentralized system of finance at the service of the local producer, not just the local consumer, that had ever existed in the world up to that point. Now, when the Americans were doing this in finance as in agriculture, they were not regulating the agricultural market or the financial market as they do today. They were reinventing or inventing the agricultural and the financial market. They were creating a kind of market that had never existed before, although they didn't understand what they were doing in those categories that I've just stated. And so the comment that I want to make is that the development, the building of the United States was the product of this interaction between the movement from above and the selective democratization below. And that unless both elements had been present, the country could not have become what it did become. Now, this combination of mobilization of resources from on top, development from on top, and selective democratization of opportunities and capabilities below did recur later in American history. But each time it recurred in a weaker form. And to what can we attribute the cumulative weakening of this dynamic that developed, that created the country? To the weakness of ideas, of thought, and to the weakness of democracy. So in thought, the Americans didn't understand what they were doing, not in these categories that I've just stated. No one formulated the idea that the market economy has no intrinsic institutional form. A market economy has, even at the most abstract level, has at least two dimensions. One dimension is absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension has to do with the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his disposal, as described by the law of property. Is the control absolute or relative? Is it unified or fragmentary? Is it perpetual or temporary? And so forth. And the legal orthodoxy, at least at the beginning of the 19th century, and in the minds of many even today, is that these two dimensions go naturally and necessarily together. But they don't go together. In fact, they contradict each other. The relativization of control is one of the paramount ways of increasing the absolute decentralization of the market. The idea that they go together and that the market economy has a single natural and necessary form is the central thesis of what you could call market fundamentalism. And even today, the practical economist in general thinks that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. But the main axis of the evolution of legal thought for 150 years, from the beginning of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, was the progressive demonstration that a market economy has no natural and necessary form. This is what the American jurists demonstrated. That as you go down the ladder, inferring the more detailed forms of the organization of the market from the more abstract forms, proceeding downward from the abstractions about private property and free contract. At each level down, you have choices to make. And you cannot resolve these choices by inferring the answers from the more abstract level, from the higher level. You can only resolve them by taking a position in conflicts of interest and of vision. Now, it wasn't leftists or progressives who asserted that thesis. It was the main American jurists. It was people like Oliver Wendell Holmes. So the idea, the doctrine that markets can be organized in radically different ways, and that these structural alternatives trump everything that you can do otherwise by merely corrective redistribution within the same structure, was an idea that no one formulated in those terms in the 19th century. So classical legal science in the early 19th century was in the grip of the idea that the system of private law has a predetermined structure. If the society is a market society, if it is what Cardozo called the scheme of ordered liberty, it's like a package which has a built-in content. You open the package and the content is already there. So there was a mystification that surrounded this invention that I described before, the reinvention of the market in finance and in agriculture, and which hid from the Americans the originality of their own institutional invention. That was the first weakness. And the second weakness was that the Americans, under their Constitution, did not organize a democracy. They organized a proto-democratic liberalism, limiting, relativizing, constraining in countless different ways the force of popular and majoritarian politics, and developing like a perpetual motion machine that was designed to inhibit the transformation of the economic and social order by politics. And it was the combination of these two weaknesses, the ideological or theoretical weakness, the weakness of thought, as I called it, and the weakness of politics, of popular politics, which tilted the scales. Now, the scales are always tilted. The conflict over the structure and its evolution always takes place in a biased ideological and social structure. And so there is always, as it were, a path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is the path opened up by the tilt. And we could say that today of the situation in which we're discussing the progressive project. It doesn't occur as if in a laboratory. It occurs in a real world where everything is biased to start with. The cards have already been dealt. They're always dealt. But the path of least resistance, although it is by definition the path that's easiest to take, is never the only path. So the progressives have always something on their side. And what they have on their side is that the alternative to the path of least resistance typically is an alternative that can exploit the potential of a technology or a production more fully than the path of least resistance. So, for example, today, the knowledge economy for the many as an alternative to the knowledge economy for the few could be said to be productively superior to the knowledge economy for the few. Karl Marx formulated a version of that idea in the notion that the alternative has a higher productivist potential than what I just call the path of least resistance. Now let's look far ahead to another moment in American history, to the middle of the 20th century, to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and to the Second World War. Now let me state a polemical thesis in the simplest and sharpest possible form. The attitude of the American progressives now is to sentimentalize the New Deal and to take it as the most reliable light that they can follow in charting their own course. But I want to argue that the New Deal is a less reliable guide to what can and should be done now than the story that I just told from the early 19th century. It's what the Americans did earlier, which is the better indication of what they would need to do now. Because in many respects, the achievements of the New Deal are more archaic and less pertinent to the fighting issues of today than what the Americans accomplished in the antebellum period. Roosevelt was a genuine radical experimentalist. And he tried to be as far-going in his experimentalism as possible. He spoke to everyone that he could. But the politician imagines that if he calls to the spirits, they will come. and usually they don't come. So the stock of institutional ideas available in the world at any moment is relatively inelastic. And it is a great struggle to enlarge them. So Roosevelt's New Deal went through 4 stages. The first stage lasted only a year and a half. From the beginning of 1933, Roosevelt's taking of power, to the middle of 1934. And despite Roosevelt's thoroughgoing experimentalism, the content of the experimentalism in the end was very limited. It had 2 themes. One theme was what in today's vocabulary we would call corporatism, the corporatist restabilization of the economy, managed competition, price controls, structured deals between business and labor and government, orchestrated by government, to restabilize the market. And the second theme was the use of the government as an employer of last resort, labor fronts, labor teams. And where did these themes come from? They were the themes that were being addressed in the world, discussed in the world at that time. So the programmatic content of Roosevelt's early radically experimentalist New Deal turns out to be almost identical to the policies of the fascist and Nazi regimes in Europe, something that no American wants to hear, but it's the truth. And that's because of this dependence of the agent on the ideas, and the nature of the ideas that they don't appear when you want them to appear. Then the second phase of the New Deal was a narrowing of the focus to the provision of antidotes to radical economic insecurity, of which the most tangible expression was the Social Security program. The wider institutional experimentalism continued in one sector, and that was the housing market. And through the organization of the housing market under the aegis of quasi-public entities, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, the Americans opened up their capital market. That was the basis for the deepening of the capital market and the creation of the modern capital market in the United States. Through the invention of a para-governmental entity, which would be the orchestrator, the creator of that market. A throwback to the earlier radicalism of the early 19th century. Then comes the third moment. The third moment was something astonishing, and that was the war economy. Because the war economy is a black box that has never been adequately studied, in which the economy was managed on completely different principles from the principles to which the Americans were supposedly devoted. They had these ideologies about the market, And it's as if it were just a mask, which they cast off, and they did everything completely differently. The whole economy was managed as a free-floating, flexible coordination between entrepreneurs and the government, with a minimum of rules. The taxes, which had always been low up to that point, became astronomical. The top marginal rate of a personal income tax in the United States at one point in the war exceeded 90%, something which is unimaginable to the Americans who are living today. And the result of this was sensational. In 4 years, the GDP of the United States more than doubled. The total volume of military procurements alone in the first 6 months of 1942 exceeded the total GDP of the United States in 1941. So there were two elements in the experience of the war economy. There was massive resource mobilization, forced production, forced saving. And there was radical institutional experimentation under the whip of war. So you might say, the experience of the war economy would suggest the need to study its lessons for the reorganization of the peacetime economy. And one might have the project of a war economy without a war, to double again the GDP of the United States and combine this massive resource mobilization with radical institutional experimentalism. But it's never been approached that way in the United States. It's always been treated as uniquely addressed to the exigencies of the war, the challenges of fighting and winning the war. And then at the end, after the wartime economy, comes the fourth stage. Roosevelt's already dead. And it's the creation of a model of economic growth led by consumption, in a period in which the progressives have no ideas about production. Their favorite economist, Keynes, was preoccupied with effective demand and provided no intellectual basis for the theory of a reconstruction of supply. So what's the lesson from this Rooseveltian experience? It's about restabilization, not about radical breakthrough and growth. And then it becomes about economic security and not about economic empowerment and democratization of the market order. And thus, I want to say that it's much less relevant to the ambitions of the contemporary American progressives than the story that I told before about the development of the United States in the antebellum period. With the exception of the episode of the war economy, which is astonishing. Now let me stop here because I've actually finished everything I wanted to say about this historical narrative before going on to the second part of my discussion. Your comments, please. Yes.
I have a question about the financial markets that
Yes.
that you initially talked about. So you talked about the fact that the initial decentralization kind of led to the more progressive area, but nowadays the market is more highly regulated. We have minimum capital requirements or stress testing requirement, and
Yes.
regulators just keep adding on piles after piles. And these were some of the regulations that were put to protect the common people against the high finance or the financial market. But you're saying that these, instead of
You mean when the Second Bank of the United States was dissolved and the creation of the local bank structure? What are you referring to?
So I'm referring to the more, within the past 20 years, there was a lot more regulations put into place.
Oh, you're talking about now, not about the 19th century.
Now, like within the past 20 years now.
Yes.
Because you're initially talking about the decentralization was something that kind of empowered the U.S. to become more progressive in the financial markets. And now we're putting more regulations in, but these regulations were put in to kind of protect the people.
Well, look at the situation in the financial crisis of 2008, right? And so there were 4 projects of re-regulation of finance. There was a resurrection of a New Deal project of Glass-Steagall, which wanted to distinguish between the banks that took federally insured deposits and the banks that were engaged in proprietary trading. That was one program. Then the second program was the new technocratic program of increasing the power of the federal government to regulate or terminate banks that were, quote, too big to fail. It was a technocratic program of increasing the power and authority of the federal government over finance. Then there was the third program, which was the program of the international financial elite, headquartered in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, to increase the capital adequacy of the banks. And there was the fourth program, which was the consumption program, protection of consumers of financial services. None of these 4 programs had anything to do with the fundamental problem of redesigning the capital market in the interest of production and inclusion. They were secondary. They were marginal. And it's because of the situation that had arisen in the country in which the country didn't understand its own structure and didn't address the problem of reinventing its own structure. Now, what happened? Now, there's a final and very important part of the historical narrative that I want to come to, and which is one of the main themes here in this course. So in the 19th century, as I've pointed out before, there were 2 regimes in the United States. In the South, there was African slavery. In the North, there was a regime of small-scale proprietors, tradesmen, artisans. Only one white man in 5 worked for another white man when Tocqueville visited the United States. Now, is that capitalism? According to Karl Marx, capitalism is the regime in which labor is bought and sold. So a regime of self-employed small-scale proprietors is, according to Marx, not capitalism. But that's what existed in the United States in the first half of the 19th century in the North. And what happened? What happened is that the Civil War accelerated something that was happening anyway, and that would have happened anyway because it happened in the whole North Atlantic world and in its outposts around the world. This regime of petty commodity production, as it's sometimes called, of small-scale property and initiative, fell victim to the relentless imperative of economies of scale. In the 19th century, the liberals and the socialists alike believed that wage labor was an inferior form of free labor. The three forms of free labor were wage labor, self-employment, or independent small property, and third, cooperation among the self-employed. That's what Abraham Lincoln believed in, that's what John Stuart Mill believed in, and that's what Karl Marx believed in a sense. But that's not what happened. So the liberals and socialists were unable to show how this property-owning democracy could be reconciled with the relentless imperative of economies of scale. And then J.P. Morgan and the corporation and the bank, the New York banks at the end of the 19th century, started to operate de facto as national banks before they were formally allowed to operate in more than one state of the Union. They said, we'll solve the problem. We'll solve the problem on the basis of big capital and big money, the corporation. And petty commodity production was undermined. So the inability to achieve an institutional invention, namely the aggregation of resources in a way that would be compatible with this radical economic decentralization, turned out to have fateful consequences. So I think I mentioned in an earlier class Rawls and his principles of justice. So he's famous for his egalitarian profession of faith, which underlies his principles of redistribution. But Rawls himself preferred property-owning democracy to welfare state capitalism. The principles of distribution are for an inferior form of social life in his eyes, which is this welfare state capitalism. That's the society that arose when this early 19th century model that I described before had already failed. He wanted to resurrect it. But on what does its resurrection depend, economically and politically, is a question which he didn't answer. So this is, as it were, the road not taken, or the failed alternative in modern Western history. In all the other countries of late British settlement, like Canada, Australia, South Africa with the Boers, there were parallel movements under labels like social credit to try and recenter the economy in the small-scale producer and show how small-scale property could be made compatible with complicated 20th century production. Now, there's some reason to think that that task is presented to us once again under the conditions of the contemporary knowledge economy. Because a large part of the labor force now has no stable connection to any business enterprise. They're a mass of individual economic agents. And the question arises, how could they be made more potent economically? How could an independent service provider become, at the same time, a little entrepreneur or a technologically equipped artisan and prosper and rise under the conditions of this knowledge economy for the few that we have? So that's the story that I wanted to tell. Because it describes one of the typical forms in which the progressive task arises under the circumstances of the contemporary world. Would someone like to make a comment about this? Yes.
Excuse me. I'm from New Zealand, so I just wanted to add New Zealand into the list.
Yes.
From before as well. But I wonder if you take a step back to your categorization of FDRs or the New Deal. Some of the elements you mentioned at the start, they seem to be really putting the face.
Now, could you turn on your mic there, your built-in mic? And you also have the alternative of using this.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, in talking about FDR, some of the things you mentioned early on would seem to fall into the category of putting a face on capitalism rather than radical reinvention. And I just wondered if that's how you see it, that, for example, the corporatism, social security work, other things are really more about that face rather than radical experimentation.
But what's the question then?
The question is, you listed social welfare, or social security, I should say, and corporatism at the start of the list of 4 or 5 things, but they seem to be more about the face of capitalism than they do seem to be radical experimentation.
They're about these havens, right? These safeguards. And that would be only half of the story. That is, the progressive project, I'm already beginning to argue, would not be just about decommodification and protections against the market. It would be about the reinvention of the market. So the force that commands the political agenda in general is the force that most credibly represents the cause of energy, of innovation, of construction. So we are now in a world in which the progressives appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. you propose a savage capitalism, and then I come on the stage and say, I'll put a human face on your project. I'll protect the losers, the vulnerable. That's the losing position. The progressives would command the agenda when they represent the cause of energy, of construction. And that's a different style of progressivism, with an idea of production and not simply an idea of distribution. And that's one of the very simple ways of describing what they have not had. But obviously the idea of production is not just economic, it's an idea of agency. And you could say the most powerful ideal in the world now is the ideal of the enhancement of agency. Agency is not just individual agency, but collective agency. How can we turn the tables on the established order in the world and give everyone this experience of freedom, which is, among other things, an experience of production? Now, Karl Marx and Keynes had in common these two ideas, that first, we're on the eve of overcoming scarcity. Marx said in the introduction to the Critique of the Gotha program, and Keynes said in his essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren. We're on the eve of overcoming scarcity. And when we overcome scarcity, we'll be able to rid ourselves of the hateful burden of work. That's the second idea. Work is a nightmare. The first idea is, but we're about to overcome the need for it. And I want to say both these ideas are false. We're not on the eve of overcoming scarcity. And work doesn't have to be a nightmare. We can have freedom in the economy and not just freedom from the economy. And that's a different approach to the economic program. So, the knowledge economy for the few that we have, and that we would want to trade for the knowledge economy for the many, is, among other things, a rationing of the freer, more creative forms of work, which is reserved for the few, and therefore the few combined with a much higher remuneration of labor. So on this view, one of the signs of the arrival of a different style of progressivism is that it would have a productivist project. And the productivist project, obviously, in the conditions, adapted to the conditions of the economy that we have now, the knowledge economy for the many. So we're going to discuss this later, but take this example of what does it depend on in the long term? The formation of an alternative style of production. It depends on two things in the long term. First, the property regime. And second, the way in which we shape the evolution of technology. So the idea that is in force now in the world is that technology has an immanent logic, an intrinsic logic of evolution. And the intrinsic logic of evolution has the following three characteristics. In the short term, we develop technology in the form that allows it to be used and assimilated, deployed by the vast firms that have huge amounts of liquid capital. Because that's what's required to purchase and internalize these technologies in the firm. Second, in the midterm, the commanding goal of technological evolution is automation. It's a substitution of labor. The point of developing the technology is to replace the worker. That's the whole point. And then in the long term, the commanding goal is to produce a machine that is as similar as possible to the human mind, a simulacrum for the human mind. That's what we call general artificial intelligence. Now, what would be the alternative in schematic form? It would say, the priority is not to produce the machines that are best capable of being assimilated by the largest firms, but to produce the machines that can be used by the vast productive periphery of the contemporary economy, which is formed by two elements. One element are the small and medium-sized firms, backward firms, of the peripheral system of production. A large part of them service providers. And the second element is the mass of individualized economic agents who have lost any stable connection to a business enterprise and who now form a major part of the labor force in every economy in the world. Now, the task of developing artificial intelligence and its associated technologies in a form that is assimilable or usable by those two elements, the backward small and medium-sized firms and the individual economic agents, is a task that requires more subtlety, more sophistication, more scientific development, not less. Artificial intelligence in an embedded and decentralized form, what's sometimes called AI on the edge. And the alternative then in the medium term is to replace the idea of automation as the commanding goal with the idea of the equipment or empowerment of the worker. A vast part of the labor force of the existing economy, of the existing economies, can be empowered or brought up closer to the frontier of the vanguard through the use of these technologies. So, for example, the nurse practitioner can become more like the physician and inherit the accumulated knowledge and capabilities of the medical system. And then in the long term, the objective is not to form a simulacrum of the human mind. The objective is to form something that is as different as possible from the human mind and is therefore better able to collaborate with the human mind. So a machine that has immense powers that we lack, computational powers, but they can serve us with imagination. It's like Schopenhauer's contrast of the talented person and the genius. Schopenhauer says, the talented person is a marksman who hits a mark that others cannot hit. The genius is a marksman who hits a mark that others cannot see. So genius is not a form of power, it's a form of vision. It's not like a super intelligence. In the academy, we see this all the time. The academics think they're entitled to be geniuses because they're super smart. And then they think genius is being even smarter. It's a kind of excellence in smartness. But it's not like that. It's a form of vision or imagination. And that's what artificial intelligence would be, the power part, to combine with us, the anti-machine. So the human being is the anti-machine with imagination. Now, what then are the projects that would be the progressive projects in this situation that results from this history that I've narrated? In economic life, now the top project is the project of replacing a knowledge economy for the few, which is what we have, by a knowledge economy for the many. The knowledge economy is now the most advanced practice of production, and it is present in every sector of the production system, not just in advanced manufacturing, but also in intellectually dense services and in precision or scientific agriculture. And in fact, one of the hallmarks of the production system in the age of the knowledge economy is the effacement of the clarity of the distinction among sectors. In particular, the effacement of the clarity of the distinction between manufacture and services. Because what is advanced manufacture but combined and bundled intellectual services? So what are the steps by which the alternative to the path of least resistance? The path of least resistance is what we have. That's the insular knowledge economy that we have. What are the steps by which we would come closer to a knowledge economy for the many? From the insular character of the knowledge economy, there result two grave evils. First, stagnation, the slowing down of the ascent of productivity, How could there not be stagnation if we deny the most advanced practice to the vast majority of firms and of workers? There's a discourse now among the economists under the label secular stagnation, which attempts to naturalize the slowdown. And it says, for example, that the technological innovations of today are inherently less revolutionary than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. It makes no sense. How could there be anything less revolutionary, less revolutionary, or more revolutionary than artificial intelligence? And the second grave evil is the deepening of inequality, which is anchored in the chasm between the vanguard and the rest, anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. If we have no response to that, we have no way of advancing the historical goals of the progressives. That's the central project. And we're going to discuss it in detail later on in the course. And there are two projects related to that or subsidiary to that. One has to do with the relation of labor to capital, and the other has to do with the relation of finance to the real economy. So the economies that are now characterized by the presence of this insular and exclusive knowledge economy, which is the only knowledge economy that we have, are also economies in which labor is fragmented and unprotected. And a vast proportion of the labor force in every economy in the world is in radically insecure employment. So there are two questions. One is, what about the organized part of the labor force, which is a shrinking minority? How can we resurrect their protection? And there's an attempt to use a 20th century instrument, unionization, to deal with this 21st century problem. And then there's the major problem of the precarious part of the labor force, the precariat, as it's sometimes called. What's the solution for them? There has to be a legal framework involving direct intervention in the employment relation to protect their interests. And what's the aim? The long-term aim. The long-term aim is that free labor be really free. And free labor can only be really free if it ceases to be just wage labor, which was naturalized as a supreme form of free labor at the end of the 19th century. Then the second problem, subsidiary problem, is the relation of finance to the real economy. And the problem can be stated as an enigma. In every economy in the world, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. The vast preponderance of the financing of production is generated within the production system itself. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's mainly consumed in trading activity. And the responsibility of finance that would be most important, which would be the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, the responsibility of venture capital, is in fact a minuscule part of the activity of the financial markets. The best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. But what does it mean in the conditions of a contemporary economy to make it more useful? So the progressive project in the economy is a project that answers these questions about the relation between the vanguard and the rest, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to the real economy or to production. Now, that's not going to happen within the form of political life that exists now. So the reformers often imagine that the antecedent condition is a reformation of politics. But no country reforms its political life in order later to decide what to do with the reformed politics. The reformation of the state and of politics only occurs in the middle of a struggle to redirect the economic course. And so it's natural to study the economic alternatives first. And the reconstruction of politics has to begin from where we are. So in the United States, it has to begin from this proto-democratic liberalism, which the Americans established at the beginning of their independent national life. And then the reorganization of the economy and of politics has to be connected with a radical transformation of education, which in turn leads into a transformation of consciousness, therefore of agency. In a country that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, it's necessary to combine the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. But above all, radically to change the character of education. So in a country like the United States, there's a dual educational system. There's the mass of ordinary public schools, which forms students for a world that no longer exists. And then the United States has, in addition to some of the worst schools in the world, some of the best schools in the rich world. But these schools are also, although among the best, the expression of a misdirection. So progressive education in the United States was shaped under the inspiration of John Dewey, the main American reformer of education. And we all know what he preached, or part of what he preached, which was cooperative analytical problem solving. That's half of the American progressive agenda in education. But the other half of Dewey's program was criticism of the ruling ideas and arrangements. And that part the Americans rejected in the educational program. And they replaced it with the mastery of a certain style of sociability, regarded as essential to performance and inclusion in the American professional and business elite. So there's a style of sociability in the United States. Characterized, for example, by a cheerful impersonal friendliness. Madame de Staël, at the start of the 19th century, prophesied the emergence of societies that would be prodigal in meetings that rob us of solitude without affording us company. Schopenhauer described the situation of humanity as a porcupines who huddle together in the cold night, prick each other with their spines, and then move apart and become cold again, and back and forth restlessly until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. So is that what we want? That middle distance? That cheerful impersonal friendliness? So the nature of a programmatic argument is it begins in the practices, realities of production, of politics, and of education. But it branches out step by step to include everything. And that's what politics should be about. So that's why I return to the thesis that I was discussing the other day with you. Politics is like philosophy. It's about everything. and it's about everything. It's about everything rather than about something in particular. And it demands everything, a total mobilization of attention and of the emotions. It's this impossible project that we somehow have to make possible. And to make it possible, we have to translate it into things that are accessible to us in the scope of a lifetime. So let's take an example from politics. The established form of political life in the United States that's expressed in the Constitution is what I call a proto-democratic liberalism. And to change it, we would have to have at least 3 sets of institutional innovations. First, innovations that increase the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. The premise of conservative political science and statecraft is that politics is either cold and institutional, or it is hot and extra institutional or anti-institutional. In other words, the premise is that at the end of the day you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. And the progressive has to have a different idea, that politics can be both hot and institutional. The different sets of political institutions alter the temperature of politics. By the temperature, I mean the level of organized participation in political life. A politics rich in structural content must be a hot politics. But is the hotness of politics just a cultural fate, or can a combination of institutional initiatives produce it? Now, supposedly there are cultures, political cultures, that are more or less hospitable to the intensity of political attention. But I say, give me a rule of mandatory voting, as exists in many democracies around the world, developed and developing. Give me prohibition of acquisition of television time. Give me the public funding of social movements and political parties, and I'll tell you that your political culture will change overnight. So that's the first set of innovations. The second set of innovations are innovations that hasten the tempo of politics. The American Constitution was deliberately designed to slow politics down. That's the Madisonian system of checks and balances. And by perpetuating impasse, for example, impasse between the two a liberal principle of fragmentation of power, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, this deliberate perpetuation of impasse. The Americans think that these two principles are naturally and necessarily conjoined, but I don't think they are. I think they're conjoined by intention to produce a particular effect. And you can affirm the liberal principle, but repudiate the conservative one. Now, I'll give you an example. If you say the two political branches are in impasse, you could say either branch would unilaterally enjoy the constitutional prerogative to resolve the impasse by calling early elections. But the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. So the elections would always be bilateral for both branches, but could be called unilaterally by either branch. And there are a large number of devices that could produce a similar effect. Because what happens in the constitutional order is that small details can have large consequences. Now take a third set of innovations in the relation between national government and local government. The conservative idea is that there's a pendular relation. Either the center has power or the localities have power. But I say, depending on the way in which you frame the shared powers of the center and the localities, you can allow the localities to deviate from the predominant solutions in the society and develop countermodels of the national future. The more they deviate, the stronger the reason to check the right of deviation, subordinated to vetting, to a double vetting by the political branches of government and by the judiciary to prevent abuse. But the principle is that a society, rather than just striking down a certain path, hedges its bets and allows parts of itself to secede from the predominant solutions and try something else out. And the first stage of an experimentalist federalism is cooperative federalism. Cooperation between the center and the locality, and cooperation among the states or among the municipalities. Now take these three sets of innovations. The innovation in the temperature of politics, the innovation in the pace of politics, and the innovation in the experimentalist use of a federal system. By the way, it doesn't have to be a federal system, because a unitary state like France or the United Kingdom can also be a basis for this experimentalism. In fact, it has an advantage, which in a unitary state there's no presumption that all parts of the federation, all parts of the state have to enjoy simultaneously the same prerogative of deviation. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, the center can make a deal with Scotland different from the deal that it makes with Wales. There's no assumption that they all have to have the same degree of experimental deviation ones that have to do with the temperature, the ones that have to do with the pace, and the ones that have to do with experimental deviation. The belief among American progressives seems to be the place to start is in the first, and in particular in the rules about the use of money in politics. But I think that's probably a mistake. The place to start is probably the third, because the third enjoys wide attraction across the divisions between right and left, and appeals to the experimentalism of the Americans, to their practicality. So that's an example of the kind of debate you have to have. Have an economic project, an economic agenda. As you pursue the economic agenda, you hit against certain limits, the limits established by the present organization of politics and the constitutional arrangements. And then you turn to the other thing, the constitutional arrangements, to deal with that. Motivated by the opportunities created in the economic realm, not by an abstract desire to form a better politics. That's the nature of the progressivism that is being presaged in this argument. But the themes are universal. So, these alternatives I'm rehearsing in the American context, we have a European form, an Indian form, a Brazilian form. In the recent historical period, the characteristic belief of the progressives is that the orthodoxy, which is social liberalism, social democracy, the orthodoxy is universal. The heresies are local. But I think, as Marx thought and as John Stuart Mill thought, that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy. So I see this series of arguments that we're beginning as arguments about the content of the universalizing heresy, reflected in the special circumstances of the major settings of national politics in the world. But there's no idea that there'll be a universal orthodoxy, and there'll be, as a response to it, the Chinese way, the Brazilian way, and so forth. The response to it has to be have a universal character. And that's a statement of an ambition that seems odd in the contemporary context, but to me seems to be inevitable. For example, the project of forming a knowledge economy for the many is a universal project, even though the difficulties that it faces are distinctive in each national setting. Now, would someone make a final comment? Question? Yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting the things you've mentioned in terms of the political side, because some of those things are more unique to the United States, and I know that's the context for today.
Details are unique, but everything that we've discussed with respect to the United States has counterparts in these other places. So there's nothing fundamentally in dominant temper of the established progressivism is redistributivist, egalitarian, softening, humanizing, and humanity wants action, creation, innovation, agency. The enhancement of agency is the central theme. That's why I want to say the alternative to shallow equality is deep freedom, not deep equality. The idea of a rigid equality of outcome or circumstance has no takers in the world. No one is interested in it. No one wants to be frugal and austere in this monastery that the classical Republicans imagined. But people want experience of intensity, which is life, vitality itself. So they have to be protected to be able to exercise agency. But the fundamental theme is the continuation of world revolution. Everywhere, all over the world. So what I would do next is to continue this discourse in the argument about Europe, European Union. But you'll see it's just a narrative that begins in a different place, but ends in a similar place. But I would want all of you to feel free to suggest to me directions that you would like me to take. I have a plan, but I'm happy to see the plan destabilized. We'll continue. That's it.
Maybe I can plug it briefly for the undergrads. We have the discussion section at 6 in this room actually. If you can't make that time slot for whatever reason, try to talk to me right now, maybe we can figure out a solution. And the rest I'm excited to get engaged in the conversation. Anton Jäger. Yes. Yeah, he's brilliant. Like
Does he have himself?
I think so. Yeah, he's known to support like leftist movements in Europe. I'm not sure